Video games are the biggest, most dominant form of media in the world, but they have a big problem with storytelling. Game storytelling today is mid, and I'm going to tell you why and what can be done about it. I need you guys to put the pitchforks down, and to put them down. Games are behind other mediums in storytelling, and that's not negotiable. There's storytelling in all forms of media. There have been great music albums that tell a story, like Blurry Face from 21 Pilots and Arcandroid by Janelle Monáe. Sorry that I can't play those for you. I would like to make some money from this video. The music sounded good, and they brought you through a story. Obviously, there have been books with a good story. That's all they are. Duh. You got Lord of the Rings and The Lord of the Flies and Dogman, Lord of the Fleas. There's just a ton of them. We've got good movies with good stories and good shows with good stories. There are plays with good stories. Trust me on that one. Everyone agrees that these mediums are good at telling stories. Games, on the whole, are not. Let's look at a fun game with a something story. Borderlands. The first one. This is the perfect example of a generic game story. You're a vault hunter, which means that you want to get cool loot. That matches pretty well with the player, and you're stuck on a harsh world that has a legendary vault with legendary loot in it. Throughout the game, you meet wacky characters and do missions that lead you through some stuff, I guess. I played this game more than once, and I can barely tell you what happened in it without having to look it up. There's a big twist, which, I guess, spoiler, guys, this game is 15 years old, and the story was not good anyway. So, you get to the vault, which is supposed to have all the big loot, and it turns out that there was never any cool loot anyway. You just get to fight a big boss. Wow. The story isn't in this game to entertain anyone. It's just there as window dressing. It's a way to get you to go to different locations with different enemy types and different terrain and different kind of guns. You don't come away from it feeling that you connected with the characters or learned anything. At best, you thought some of the characters were wacky and funny, and the characters that you play as are generic and boring. They only have a few voice lines that play over and over and over again. If I have to hear, "It's like Christmas," another time, I'm gonna lose it. But most people would agree with me that that game has a bad story. What if we talk about a game that has a good story? But before that, I'm gonna need you guys to subscribe to the channel because almost none of you guys subscribe, and that kind of hurts. I'm gonna need you guys to subscribe so we can get these numbers up, okay? The Last of Us. I'm not going to spoil this game because it's not a 15-year-old game that's really about running around and shooting and getting cool guns. On its face, The Last of Us has a great story. You're playing as Joel in this unique world that has fungus zombies, and you're escorting around Ellie. You get to see a lot of character development in both Joel and Ellie throughout the game. And on the gameplay side, you got some fun set pieces that I won't spoil and just generally fun gameplay. So, what's the problem? The problem is that these halves don't mix often. Sometimes the gameplay will lend itself to the story, like in this scene where they use just very simple gameplay to do some bonding between the characters.
Really? Just gonna leave me hanging? Alright, let's see how it is.
For the most part, though, you play the game, and you're playing a third-person zombie shooter. Then you get to a cutscene, and it's a good story. And chances are, you're gonna like one of these halves a lot more than the other. So, you either get to endure a third-person zombie shooter to get to the cutscenes, or you're enduring the cutscenes to get back to the fun third-person zombie shooter. The other problem is that this story works just as well not in a video game. Nowadays, there's a Last of Us show. It's doing great. People love it. Guess what? You lose very little from the story in translation to TV. Turns out, the story of Last of Us is a good TV show put into a zombie shooter. Are you seeing the problem yet? Story and gameplay in most games are treated as two completely separate parts. They don't mix, and that hurts both of them. It ruins the pacing of a good story to sometimes have multiple hour chunks of gameplay in between each plot beat. I mean, The Last of Us, our last example, honestly does this better than most games. Let's look at Skyrim. It's a great game, legendary game. But the story is basically worthless because you could spend up to 30 hours doing random stuff before you get to the next piece. And then you've forgotten all the stuff that came before. Sure, some of the side quests are kinda interesting, but most of the story in them completely falls off as soon as you realize that 90% of the quests are just an excuse to send you into a dungeon to kill a bunch of guys and collect a thing. But the game has to do this because the gameplay loop of Skyrim looks something like this. Explore, find a person or a thing that sends you on a quest, go into a cave and kill everything, collect something from the cave and leave, and then turn in the quest. Then you're back to exploring again and the loop restarts. This is a fun gameplay loop. You also see that story doesn't fit into most of that gameplay loop. Okay, let's look at another good game, God of War. The new God of War, not the old one. In the new God of War, you play as Kratos, and you are trying to scatter your wife's ashes at the highest peak in the Nine Realm. You're doing this with your son, Atreus, who you're protecting and teaching. The relationship between Kratos and Atreus is solid. You get to see it evolve over the course of the game as Atreus becomes more competent and Kratos becomes more trusting in him. Completely transforms Kratos' character as we see him both as a protector and a killing machine. And they take this epic adventure through Norse mythology that gets us a lot of cool scenes and set pieces. And yet, once again, we find a disconnect. That story I told you about has almost nothing to do with what it's like to play God of War. For most of the game, you are a killing machine that mows down hordes of enemies. There's huge set-piece boss fights that we don't really want to spoil for you that feel great to play. Makes you feel like you're unstoppable. And then we go into a slower cutscene that, while fine, is mostly there to break up the pacing of the game. The story is fine, moving towards pretty good if we were to take it by itself. But as a game story, it's amazing. It's like 10 out of 10 perfection. Wow. It goes to show how low the bar is in gaming. God of War is a great game, but it also shows just how much story is subject to gameplay in a video game. It makes gaming look like a poor storytelling medium, but a very fun playing medium. The fact that people talk about the story being good in the Spider-Man games should be all you need to know. It's like we get an okay Spider-Man movie, but in place of the interesting character development for Spider-Man or the fun character scenes, we get a lot of swinging around town and beating up generic enemies. Don't get me wrong, I love swinging around town, and I love beating up generic enemies. But when I played Spider-Man Miles Morales, which I think is a great game, by the way, I was bored to tears when I had to do the family dinner cutscene. What am I doing here? I couldn't help think that I would much rather be just watching Into the Spider-Verse again than sitting through this awkwardly acted, awkwardly written scene that's just trying to get me swinging around and beating up generic enemies again. But some games have actually good stories, you might be saying, and I want to look at one of them. Let's look at Detroit Become Human. It's a game about androids that's an allegory for slavery in America. Yes, they even said that. Okay, that's what it's about. But it's a good story with 3 separate characters showing off different aspects of what it's like to be an oppressed android. Some of it is cheesy, some of it's on the nose, but it still works. The painting scene from the early part of the game still gets me, even if it was a bit cheesy. Problem is, Detroit's not a video game, not really. It's a choose-your-own-adventure TV show. There is no need to integrate the gameplay with the story because there is no gameplay. You make your character walk around sometimes, but even then, you're greatly restricted as to where you can go, and you get very few choices there, and you press buttons that come up on the screen. Yes, you can fail by not pressing the buttons good enough, but in a lot of ways, that part even just feels cheap, like it's not what the experience is supposed to be. I'm here to make some decisions and see how they turn out, not to prove that I can press the X button really fast. It's a great story, but it's not a video game. No one ever played Detroit and said, man, I loved how I got to press square a lot. I want to do that part again. And I just went through this whole thing about how I love Detroit and its story, and guess what? I never played the game. I watched it on YouTube. And I got the same experience. We've covered a lot of ways that you can do game story wrong. Ultimately, they all come down to a disconnect between the gameplay and the story. But it doesn't have to be this way. Let's talk about a game that does story right. Hades is an indie action game, and it seems like, honestly, the last type of game we should be talking about when we talk about game stories. But it's a great example of how you can actually mix story and gameplay together. Hades is a roguelike. You die, and then you go back to the beginning of the game. This is a great video game mechanic, but it's usually not very conducive to storytelling. In most games, when you die, that isn't part of the story. It's a mistake that we have to go back and buff out by playing it right. Some games like Assassin's Creed give you a canonical reason why the player can die and play again, but Hades goes further and integrates the death and restart cycle directly into the story. You're playing as Zagreus, the son of Hades. When you die, you go right back to the House of Hades, which is where you started. The whole story is built on Zagreus trying again and again to break free from the house. So even the deaths in the game contribute to the story. Characters will acknowledge that you died and talk about what happened in your last run. Within the gameplay, you have a lot of recurring characters. Your relationships with them are reinforced through the constant fighting you do. They also do something rather rare in Hades. The storytelling regularly interrupts the gameplay flow. So instead of in a game like Uncharted, where you get a long chunk of gameplay and then a break with cutscenes, Hades has a lot of smaller conversations after small chunks of gameplay. Closer to a conversation every minute or so than it is every hour. It also gives you gameplay benefits for talking to characters and giving them gifts, so you're always balancing getting more story and getting better gameplay. I regularly found myself shifting how I played the game just so I could have a conversation with a character I was more interested in. It might have been better to get an Ares boon this run, but I kind of wanted to hear more about what Artemis was saying about the story the last time we talked. For a while, every time I died, I would seek out Megara in the cafe. She wasn't always there, but I wanted to reach the next stage of our conversation to learn more about her backstory and more about Zagreus' backstory, and also because I could see in the menu that I was getting close to unlocking something cool in gameplay. These character connections that feed into gameplay carry all the way to the ending of the game, although I don't really want to spoil that in any way. Hades is a great example, but it's not the only one. The Fire Emblem series has done a good job of storytelling, sometimes. The last game that came out, Fire Emblem Engage, was basically like a children's cartoon with war thrown into the middle of it, but not a good one like Avatar. I mean, that has war in it, but a bad one. Like if you were to take Johnny Test and make us take it seriously as a war story. Sorry, I'm getting off in the weeds here. There are good Fire Emblem games that do a great job of blending story with gameplay. In Fire Emblem Awakening, you have a strategy RPG where the big unique mechanic was that you could pair 2 units together in one square. Wow. It was powerful in the gameplay by itself, but people who fought paired together built stronger relationships together. Then you could go watch unique conversations between them. I mean, that does an okay job of blending gameplay and story, but it only goes one way. Your gameplay feeds into the story, not the story feeding back into the gameplay. Except, there was also a feature in the game where you could have characters get married and have children that would share traits from their parents. And so suddenly, it really mattered which characters you were pairing together. And you also cared a lot more about the characters and their relationships because you were also thinking about how compatible they would be in a gameplay sense. Compatibility from gameplay, compatibility from personality, it was all working together. The later games have done something similar as well. In Fire Emblem Three Houses, it has some of the character building gameplay, but honestly, that's more as a diversion. Okay, you spent an hour and a half doing a tactical strategy meeting, you might be a little tired of strategy. Now, go run around and talk to your friends. Still, it went a lot further than most games do in turning story content into gameplay. Not just a movie that's cut up into bits in the middle of the game. Like, I loved Call of Duty Black Ops campaign, but the story ultimately didn't matter. There were like 2 things that I can remember from it, and about 1.5 of a character's name. It was just fun to run around shooting guys on crazy missions. The story didn't matter at all. It's not that all games have bad stories, it's that so few games manage to actually use the medium to tell something that couldn't be told better elsewhere. There are really good ways that you can integrate storytelling into the gameplay itself. You have to always be aware of the fact that necessary gameplay features can drag the player out of the story. Imagine if you were watching an Avengers movie and a button prop popped up on the screen. Games are really good at building connections to characters through both dialogue and gameplay. That's the advantage that they have over other forms of media. In a lot of ways, it can have character connection that feels a lot deeper than it does in movies and TV. What the player does in games is part of the story. And as long as designers keep that in mind, they can do great things with it. Thanks for watching.